thank you all for coming on this beautiful spring evening in January. My name is James Geary. I will be talking about wit, what wit is, how it works, and why we need it, in exactly that order. But I have to say, first, a little bit about the book itself. If you haven't read it, it's written in different styles. Every chapter is written in a different style. And that's to kind of explore the different kinds of wit that there are. So, for example, there's a chapter about the neuroscience of wit, and that's written as a scientific paper. There's a chapter about the spiritual wit, the wit of spirituality. That's written like a sermon. There's a rap song in it. That's not funny, actually. There's part of it is written in jive, which is a very linguistically ingenious and witty form of language. And I have to confess, right at the beginning of this talk, that when I told people I was writing a book about wit, they laughed at me. And, they said, well, that's got to be a pretty, that's a pretty tall order. That's a pretty big ambition to write a book about wit. And all I can say now is, having finished the book, they're not laughing now. It was a joke. You're allowed to laugh at that. In fact, that was my best joke of the evening, so it's all going to be downhill from here. When we think about wit, we tend to think of witty one-liners. I've written a couple books about aphorisms, and that's what I think of or I used to think of when I think about wit. Some of my favorites: Lily Tomlin. All my life, I always wanted to be somebody. I realize now I should have been more specific. Jean Cocteau, that great surrealist poet, playwright, filmmaker, and boxing promoter. Mirrors would do well to reflect a little longer before sending back images. And one of my all-time favorites, Fania Ranovskaya, a Russian actress from the 1920s. You can check her out on YouTube. She said, baldness is the gradual transformation of the head into an ass. First in shape, then in content. So these are all witty remarks, but what I discovered from writing this book was that wit is not only verbal, it can be visual as well, and it doesn't have to have anything to do with language. There is physical wit, there's intellectual wit, there's spiritual wit, there's all kinds of different wit, and that's why I wrote the book in the styles that I did. So what I'd like to do is first start off with an exploration of what wit is, and this brings me to this gentleman here, Alexander Pope. There's also a chapter written in his heroic couplets, actually 2 chapters, and he's got one of the best definitions of wit that I've ever come across, and I'll read it for you, for those of you in the back. True wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought, but ne'er so well expressed. What I like about that definition is that it talks about wit as being natural. Wit is not some kind of exceptional ability that only geniuses have. It's something that's quite natural. To advantage dressed, but it's performative. It's dressed up. Wit is nature that's kind of enhanced or embellished. What oft was thought. So again, it's not like a rare insight or a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Wit is something that we think of and do and experience every day. But ne'er so well expressed. There's something about the clarity and the precision of wit that makes a thing witty. But there's one thing that is conspicuously absent from this definition, something that when we think about wit, I think we tend to think of it, and I'm wondering if anyone in this lovely standing room only audience can tell me what it is that's missing. Yes? Timing. Timing is missing. That's not what I was thinking of, but that's also a second thing that is missing. Wit is spur of the moment. It's improvisational. Humor. There's nothing in here about being funny. And that's bad news for the next 30 or 40 minutes, ladies and gentlemen. Because wit has nothing to do with being funny. Wit can be funny, but wit is about making connections more than it's about making jokes. So I just want to give you an example of wit that isn't funny, but it's still witty. Legendary Chinese general called Kung Ming, and he was beloved by his soldiers because he was such a brilliant battlefield strategist. But in one battle, he and his army were losing badly, and they were being chased up the Yangtze River by the enemy, and they had completely run out of arrows. They had no ammunition left. And so they were camped by the river, and they're just kind of stuck, and they didn't know what to do. So the emperor, who was secretly jealous of Kung Ming, because Kung Ming was far more beloved by his men than the emperor himself, the emperor went to Kung Ming, and he said, "You need to make for me 100,000 arrows in 3 days, or I will execute you." And Kung Ming, being a good soldier, he said, "I will do that, emperor, and if I fail to do that, then my life will be forfeit." So they're all out of arrows. They're being preyed upon by the opposing army, camped by the side of the river, no food, bedraggled and hungry. What does Kung Ming do on the first day? He does nothing. So his men kind of a little bit nervous, but this is Kung Ming. He's always pulled through before. And so they figure Kung Ming must have a plan. The second day comes, and what does Kung Ming do? Can anybody guess? Wow, yes, he does nothing. Okay, trick question now. Third day comes. By this time, the third day, Kung Ming's men are starting to panic a little bit because 100,000 arrows, nobody's doing anything. Kung Ming is just kind of sitting in his tent, staring into the fire. But the third day comes. What does Kung Ming do? Pardon me? No, but thank you for participating. He does nothing. But on the night of the third day, Kung Ming instructs his troops to load every single boat that they have with bales of hay, and he instructs them to throw black cloths over the bales of hay. He ties the boats together, and he lowers them down the river towards the camp of the opposing army. When all the boats are just outside the camp of the opposing army, Kung Ming tells his troops to beat their war drums as if they're about to attack. What does the opposing army do? They leap from their tents, they unleash volley after volley into the boats. All the arrows land harmlessly in the bales of hay. Once they're done, Kung Ming tells his troops, pull those boats back. They get the arrows. The next morning, Kung Ming goes to the emperor and he says, "Here are your 100,000 arrows, emperor. Tomorrow we shall return them to our enemy." So why is that witty? Because Kung Ming, when he got that assignment from the emperor, he studied the weather, and he predicted that there would be a dense fog rolling up the Yangtze River on the third day, and that is in fact exactly what happened. So that is witty. That is coming up with a solution when you have to a problem, when you have very, very few resources. It's creative, it's improvisational, and it's devised on the spur of the moment. One thing it is not is funny. So I have to give you a funny example now, a funny example of wit. This is by a guy named Herschel Osterpoyer, who is an actual historical figure. He lived in what is now Ukraine in the late 18th, early 19th centuries. And he was, he couldn't hold down a job, let's put it that way. He was well-loved in his community. Everybody loved his jokes and his constant joking, but because of his constant joking, he could not really be gainfully employed. As a result, he was kind of poor. He was always hungry, didn't really have a fixed abode. So people kind of took care of him in the village. And he was invited to dinner at someone's house one night, and he was seated across from a very wealthy local aristocrat. And this very wealthy local aristocrat was really not very charmed by Herschel because Herschel was starving. He didn't have great table manners. And so he was kind of stuffing food into his face because he took any opportunity to get a meal. And the aristocrat sitting across the table from him was clearly disgusted by Herschel. And he sneered at Herschel and he said, "What separates you from a pig is what I'd like to know." And Herschel said, "The table." So that's an example of wit that is funny. So like I said, I think more than a sense of humor, wit is a state of mind. It's a kind of intelligence, a kind of practical improvisational intelligence that you can use in lots of different situations. And that's why I think Dorothy Parker's definition is quite a good one. There's a hell of a distance between wisecracking and wit. Wit has truth in it. Wisecracking is simply calisthenics with words. You like that? Good, I'm glad you like that. And thank you for sharing with the group. So there is a relationship between wit and intelligence. And if you think about how we use wit in everyday language, we have words like to outwit someone, or to be quick-witted, or someone is a dimwit or a nitwit. You live by your wits, you come to your wits' end. These are all words that have to do with intelligence, and not with being funny. And so actually the etymology of the word wit, it comes from a Sanskrit verb that means to see, vid. And vid is the same word that, the same root of words in English like video, which you see. But it's also, wit is the same root, wit is as in witness. When you witness something, you see something. Journalists bear witness. Wit and wisdom also come from that same word, vid. So etymologically and psychologically, wit and wisdom are actually the same thing. So there's, like I said, different kinds of wit, different kinds of ways that this gets expressed in various forms of human endeavor. The serendipitous wit of scientists, optical wit of artists, improvisational wit of musicians and rappers, and the metaphysical wit of philosophers. So this leads me to my own definition of wit. Wit is the quick, instinctive intelligence that allows us to think, say, or do the right thing at the right time in the right place. So, give you some examples of that. Thinking of the right thing to do in the right time at the right place. Famous philosopher, linguist J.L. Austin gave a lecture at Columbia University, in which he observed that every language in the world you could use a double negative to make a positive. So I do not disagree with J.L. Austin's theory about that. That's a double negative that is a positive. But he also observed that in no language is there an example where two positives make a negative. And from the back of the auditorium, another Columbia professor, Sidney Morgenbesser, said, yeah. So here's an example of doing something wittily. Alfredo Moser, he lives in a small village in Brazil where there's no electricity, very unreliable supplies of fuel, everything. And he was experimenting one day with plastic water bottles, and he was trying to refract light at sufficient strength to start a fire because he didn't have matches, there was no sources of fuel, nothing. And he was just looking for a practical way to start a fire. And it didn't work, but he realized that he might be able to do something else with these bottles filled with water. So what he did was cut a hole in his roof, and these are big liter bottles of water, and he put the bottle halfway through, so half was sticking into his house and half was sticking above his roof. He sealed the edges, put some bleach in the water to prevent algae, and he noticed that when the sun was out, it created illumination inside his house, the equivalent of a 40-watt bulb. No electricity needed at all. And these are now called liters of light, and they're in use all over the developing world, and they allow people to work, study, read, be indoors without and having light enough to work without any kind of power except the sun. So that's an example of doing something witty. Serendipity is a kind of wit, because he was trying to solve one problem and realized he had a solution to a different problem. So saying something witty, so that's the where we'll spend a few minutes and I'll give you some examples, little tips. I don't want you to go away without some practical tips of how you too can be witty. Start the new year right. Denis Diderot, French philosopher, the guy who came up with the idea of the encyclopedia back in the 18th century. He was also at a dinner party, not the same one as Herschel, but another one. And he was also insulted. Apparently, this is what happens at dinner parties. I don't know. People insult each other. However, poor old Denis Diderot, unlike Herschel, could not come up with a quick response. So he was leaving the dinner party. We've all had this experience, I think, walking down the stairs, and he goes, that's what I should have said. He thought of the witty comeback too late, only when it was too late to actually deliver it. And good for Denis, he came up with a word for this, l'esprit d'escalier, the wit of the staircase. And the wit of the staircase is the wit that you get only after it's no longer useful to you. So I don't want anybody here to experience the trauma and the tragedy that Denis Diderot did. So I've come up with 5 ways to be witty, and these are 5 things that you can do, not right now, but later after the talk, to get a little wit in your life. Okay. The first thing is to take things literally. So much of our language is metaphorical. We're not really even aware of how often we use metaphor. Just look at any newspaper headline, the fallout from the government shutdown, GOP support is beginning to fracture, I'm feeling up today, or I'm feeling down, Juliet is the sun. These are all metaphors. One estimate says that we use like 6 to 10 metaphors every minute. But I think that is a gross underestimation. And I've got a line here from the FT to prove it. This is an actual sentence from the Financial Times. It's 31 words. I will read it aloud, and I'd like us to collectively identify how many metaphors are in the sentence. Are you with me? So I'll just read the sentence and just shout out and stop me when you hear a metaphor. A solid end. One metaphor. Is someone keeping count here? A solid end to the first quarter. Yep, 2 metaphors. There are no quarters in a year. On Wall Street. That's a metaphor. That's a specific kind of metaphor. My high school English teacher, Mr. Don Staley, is here, and he can identify what kind of metaphor that is. It's either a metonymy or a synecdoche. I can't remember. One of them is a town in New York. A solid end to the first quarter on Wall Street prepared Asian bourses for an upbeat start. 4th metaphor. But a deluge, 5, of mixed data, 6, took the wind, 7, out of a potential rally, 8. 31 words, 8 metaphors. So that's how pervasive metaphor is in daily life, not just in poetry. So metaphors and wit are related because they both involve making novel comparisons or novel connections between very different things. And a great way to be witty is to take the things that people say or do metaphorically, literally, like this New Yorker cartoon. This is a guy visiting his doctor. He's got a dagger sticking out of his back, and his doctor says, "Good news, the test results show it's a metaphor." So, another great example of taking things literally is Groucho Marx. He's a great example of many things. He was living in LA in the 50s, and his son was refused entry to the country club swimming pool because they didn't admit Jews. And so Groucho's son came home and he told Groucho what had happened, and Groucho was naturally infuriated. So what did Groucho do? He immediately dashed off a telegram to the country club, and he explained to the country club that his son's mother was not a Jew, So could he go in up to his waist, please? Because he's only half Jewish. So you see, when you take something meant figuratively, literally, you can make the person who said it look ridiculous. And of course, this is also why kleptomaniacs don't understand metaphors, because they take things literally. Oh. Okay. Charm's wearing off, is it? Okay. Let's move on to the second category then. Make category mistakes. So, in philosophy, a category mistake is when something is presented, something that belongs in one category is presented or understood as if it belonged to a different category. It's a philosophical thing. And there's two category mistakes in this clip from the Marx Brothers movie, Duck Soup, which I highly recommend. I'll just set it up. The guy in the middle is the scheming ambassador Trentino, and he's hired Chico and Harpo to find incriminating information about Groucho. And I'm hoping the audio is going to be sufficient. So just pay attention. I'll point out the category mistakes as they happen.
Gentlemen, please, will you tell me what you found out about Firefly?
Can anyone hear it? Okay. Doesn't matter. They're asking him what he's found out about Firefly, and Chico is saying nothing really. And Trentino's getting very upset, and he's asking, where is his criminal record? Did you get his criminal record? Harpo produces it.
No.
That's two category mistakes there. So the first category mistake, forgive my narration, first category mistake is Trentino says criminal record, and Harpo produces a phonograph record. Trentino throws it into the air in fury. Second category mistake, Harpo interprets it as a skeet shooting target. So those are category mistakes are really a guaranteed way to be witty. And these category mistakes also happen in journalism, usually inadvertently. Here's a couple headlines. Include your children when baking cookies. I'm a vegetarian myself, but I don't make any value judgments. These are actual headlines, by the way. Never withhold herpes infection from a loved one. I can think of some circumstances where you would want to withhold a herpes infection from a loved one, but again, I'm not making any value judgments. These are all category mistakes. Aphorisms often work by categories mistakes as well. Josh Billings, contemporary of Mark Twain, in the 19th century, was more famous than Mark Twain. Was Mark Twain before Mark Twain was Mark Twain? One of his great aphorisms is a category mistake. Be like a postage stamp. Stick to one thing until you get there. Okay, third way to be witty is to benignly violate expectations. So here's another pop quiz. What is that a picture of? Loch Ness Monster. Sorry, I didn't hear it in the back. Oh, that was Mr. Staley ruining my whole setup here. He said 3 curly marks. Yes, I'm sorry to disappoint you. It is not the Loch Ness Monster. It's actually just 3 black marks on a white screen. But there's really some inventive interpretations of this. Some people say it's a mustache. Some people say it's a Viking submerged up to his helmet in a lake. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but it's just kind of 3 black marks on a white screen. But our brains are pattern-making, pattern-finding machines. And we will find or make a pattern anywhere, especially when only partial information is given. So this is partial information, and we imagine that we see the Loch Ness Monster under what must be the water. But that's just our brain creating that image. It's not actually there. It's just 3 squiggly marks. So another way to be witty is because the brain works that way, and now we know it, is to violate those expectations, but to do it benignly. Because if you have a malign violation, that's what a horror film is. I've just malignly violated that young child. So in a horror film, there's a jump scare scene, and that's where the villain's face suddenly appears with a loud noise, and that's a malign violation because that kind of is shocking and violates your expectations, but in a way that feels threatening. A benign violation is what jokes are about. That's when your expectations are violated, but in a way that doesn't feel threatening. Great example of this, Wily Coyote. Any Wily Coyote fans in the audience? Great. So there's 3 benign violations in this little clip, and fortunately I don't have to narrate this one because there is no talking. So I'll just, again, watch and we'll shout them out when they occur. Number 1. Number 2. Number 3. So there's 3 benign violations in a 30-second clip. The first is when the Roadrunner runs into the painting. The second is when the truck comes out of the painting. But what's brilliant about Chuck Jones is that the third benign violation is restoring the expectations that have been violated by the first 2 violations. Not for the poor coyote, yeah. But here's another. Who is the witty one in this cartoon? Is it Wily Coyote or the Roadrunner? The Roadrunner. Anyone think Wily Coyote is the... Good, because I agree with you. I think Wily Coyote is the witty one. That's why he's called Wile-E Coyote. There's a clue in the name. But he's the one who comes up with all these ingenious schemes to get the Roadrunner. They never succeed, but nobody guaranteed you that wit equals success. Wit is not about succeeding. It's about being ingenious. And so, Wile E. Coyote, super genius. So benign violations are the way that lots of parables work. And that's one of the reasons why parables are so easy to remember, is because they surprise you. There's another little village, and every day a poor old woman would go and stand outside the baker's shop. And she had no money, and she was always hungry, but she just liked to stand outside the baker's shop and smell the delicious bread when it was freshly baked in the morning. And eventually, this started irritating the baker. And so one day, he saw the woman outside his shop, and he came out and he said, "Look, if you're going to stand there every morning and smell my bread, you have to pay me." And the woman said, "I can't pay you. I don't have any money." And the baker said, "Well, then you have to leave." So soon enough, the whole village gathered round, and some people sided with the baker, and some people sided with a poor old woman. And eventually, they decided to take the case to King Solomon, as one does in the absence of a Supreme Court. So they go to King Solomon, and he hears both sides, and he says to the poor old woman, he says, "You do have to pay the baker to smell his bread. How much money do you have?" And she kind of just reaches into her pocket and jingled the 2 or 3 pennies that were in her pocket. And King Solomon turned to the baker and said, "Baker, you have been paid." And the baker said, "Wait, she didn't give me any money." And King Solomon said, "Didn't you hear the sound of her coins? That's payment for the smell of your bread." Benign violations. Okay, the fourth way to be witty is to use Talmudic logic. So the Talmud is a treatise on Jewish observance and Jewish law. And what is amazing about the Talmud is that it's basically a centuries-long argument among lots of different rabbis. And what what's really interesting about it is, unlike Catholicism, for example, where the Pope is infallible, the Talmud is not infallible, and in fact, it's not really even finished, and no conclusion is actually definitively reached in the Talmud. What's valued and prized in the Talmud is the ingenuity of the argument, the wittiness of the argument. And so Talmudic logic is another great way to be witty. And there's another story that involves our old friend Herschel, who was again invited to someone's house, this time for lunch. And his friend said, on your way over, would you mind stopping by the baker? Not the baker who charged the poor old woman for the bread, but another baker. Would you mind stopping by the baker and picking up a couple loaves of bread for lunch? And Herschel said, no, I wouldn't mind at all. So he did so, and he noticed that, just like in this picture, one of the loaves was much larger than the other one. So when he got to his friend's house, he gave his friend the smaller loaf, and he kept the larger loaf for himself. And his friend was kind of upset, and he said, well, that's rude. And Herschel said, what do you mean that's rude? What would you have done in my place? And his friend said, well, I would have kept the smaller loaf and given you the larger one. And Herschel said, but you've got the smaller one, so what are you complaining about? That's an example of Talmudic logic. The logic is absolutely faultless, but it really doesn't pertain to the situation at hand. So this is also, Talmudic logic is also the way lots of very witty jokes work. Irishman walks into a bar. Bet you never heard a joke that begins that way before. And he orders 3 pints of Guinness. And he takes a sip from each pint sequentially until he finishes them. And then he orders a second round, and he does exactly the same thing. And every time he comes into this pub, he drinks the same way. He orders 3 pints, takes a sip of each one until he finishes them. So the bartender finally asks, why? None of my business, but why do you drink that way? And the Irishman says, well, that's to remember my brothers, one of whom moved to Australia and one of whom moved to America. And we all drink this way to remember the times when we drank together. Makes sense. A little bit expensive, but it makes sense. So one night, the Irishman comes into the bar and he orders only 2 pints. Silence falls across the pub. And when he comes up to get the second round, the bartender says, gosh, I'm so sorry. My condolences. And the guy thinks for a second. He says, my brothers are fine. It's just I've stopped drinking. Talmudic logic. Great way to be witty. Okay, another pop quiz. The fifth and final way to be witty is to free associate. This is called the Remote Associates Test, or RAT, as we like to call it in the trade. And basically what you have to do here is you're given 3 words, and you have to find the word that connects them. And I'll read them out, and just shout it out as soon as you think of it. Cottage. Okay, it's cheese. Thank you very much. But let me read the words first. Cottage Swiss cake. Cheese. Okay. Sense courtesy place. Dust cereal fish. Nice. You guys are good at this. So this is like a creativity test that was devised in the 1960s, and it's based on the idea that creativity involves combining and recombining and making associations between or among very different things. And that's essentially what's happening here with language. And that's essentially what wit is too. It's making connections among very different things from very different fields. And this is also how discovery works. You know, so many discoveries were made by accident. Like the guy who invented Velcro. He noticed that a burr was sticking to his dog's fur when he was out for a walk, and then he got an idea. That's recombinatorial creativity. It's wit. Bowl. Sorry about that. So This is another sort of creativity test. It's called multiple object tracking. And whereas the previous one had to do with language, this one has to do with physical objects. And you see there's like 9 blue dots. 4 of them have a little square around them. And when I press play, they're all going to move around the screen. And your job is to keep your eye on the 4 dots with squares around them, and then identify where they end up at the end. Okay? There'll be a quiz afterwards. Okay. So, did anyone get 4? Did anyone get 3? Did you get 3? Did anyone get 2? Did anyone get 1? Okay. How did you get 3? Yes, precisely. She said she expanded her vision. The way to keep track of these things is to not focus on any one in particular, but to focus on the whole field, your whole field of vision. And that's the way you can pay attention to more things than one at the same time. If you try and like focus on each of those 4 dots individually, you'll never get it. And this is in fact the way that puns work. So this is how puns work. Now, puns are supposed to be considered the lowest form of wit. Yeah, that's the way I feel. But actually, I think puns are the highest form of wit because they also prove that everyone is witty. Because when you make a pun, when you've seen one shopping mall, I just ruined it. When you've seen one shopping center, you've seen a mall. Get it? Yeah, that was my best pun too, and I ruined it. So Georges de Bièvre, a 17th century French nobleman, he was a great punster, and he was walking in the garden at Versailles one time. He bumped into the king, and the king knew he was really good at puns. So the king said to Georges, "You, who are so good at puns, make a pun on me." And Georges said, "The king is not a subject." This is my second best pun. I didn't screw that one up. Anyway, when you make a pun, you're making you've got all these possible meanings of that word or those words spinning around in your head, and then suddenly you make the connection between subject, the person who's ruled by a king, and subject, the topic of a sentence, and that's where you get a pun. So what's interesting about puns and why I think they're the highest form of wit is that because the person who makes the pun, or the person who gets the pun, who understands the pun, is making exactly the same connection as the person who makes the pun. You're just making it in a different direction. So Georges de Bièvre made that connection, and he followed that connection in one way, but when you get that pun, you make exactly the same connection. You follow it the other way, but you're doing the same creative work. You have the same amount of wit. The person who makes a pun and the person who gets a pun are equally witty. The question is, how do you distinguish between being witty and being clever? And really, I think cleverness is an aspect of wit. Like Alfredo Moser, who came up with the leaders of light, that's clever. But he's clever with his hands. Herschel, who came up with the great comeback to the rude aristocrat sitting across the table, he's clever as well. So I think cleverness, Wily Coyote is clever. I think cleverness is like a subset of wit. I wouldn't really distinguish it. Cleverness is an aspect of wit.
How about limericks?
Do you know any? The question is, how about limericks? Do you know any?
Limericks?
Yeah. Would you like to share any? Keep it clean. Keep it clean.
There are two about people that no one knows.
So, are limericks witty? Yeah, they can be. Also, light verse, like light verse poetry that's light verse, like Dorothy Parker and people like that. I think that's it's very, very witty. Why do we groan at puns? Does anyone have an answer to that? Speak for yourself, sir. So puns, I don't know. Why do we groan at puns? Charles Lamb, English essayist, he wrote an essay that called "That the worst puns are the best." And I don't know why we groan. I don't know why puns. People kind of frown on puns. It's a mystery to me. But I agree with Charles Lamb. Like if you remember the remote associates test, when you're making connections among those different words, it's called the remote associates test. So the more remote the associations are, the more creative it is. The further you have to go to find that comparison. And I think the puns that we groan at, are typically the puns that you really have to go a long way to reach. And maybe it's just the intellectual effort makes you groan. I don't know, but I think that's a sign of the groan. You may not find it funny, but what I admire about bad puns like that is that how far the person went to make that connection. And I think that's being creative. You may not enjoy the result, or you may not think it's funny, but it's definitely witty because it's gone a long, long way to find that connection. Because they're so wholesome. Yes, we don't like the wholesome puns. Yeah. So I used to work for Time magazine for a long time with that gentleman over there, and one of the things that I learned a lot about writing for Time magazine, about how to write, and a lot of time and attention was paid to the kicker, and the kicker. For those of you who are not journalists, that's like the last sentence or the last paragraph in the story. And that's the thing that you want to have a kick, so that it's kind of, you come to the end of the article, and instead of kind of being let down, you're kicked up. And so often in crafting the kicker, we'd spend a long time trying to come up with the right kicker. So maybe it's finding something at the beginning of the article and bringing it back at the end, or having some kind of, dare I say, pun at the end, or making some kind of interesting reversal. So that's a kind of linguistic way to be witty in journalism. But also I think story selection, coming up with ideas, that can be very, very witty. Helen Rosner, who's the food writer for The New Yorker, she did a great story about the wedge salad, which is apparently the only vegetable that Donald Trump eats. And she did this great project on investigating how wedge salads get onto someone's plate in America. And guess what? It has everything to do with immigration. Because the people who harvest the wedge salads are coming from across our southern border to work legally in the United States. And so I think that's a great example of journalistic wit, because she saw a connection, and that's what I mean about making connections. She saw a connection between a really controversial political issue and something that all of us encounter every single day, and that the president has a particular fondness for. So I think that's another example of wit. Oh, let's have a groan for this gentleman here. Yeah. I've grown up so much tonight. I can't comment on dad humor, no. I don't know. I really don't know. I wasn't going to say that, but that's possible. They think they're funnier than they are. I don't know. I think you can explore different ways that men are witty than women, or if making jokes is like a performative thing that men feel like they have to do. Or dads in particular. I don't know. But it's not, again, I don't associate puns necessarily with dad humor because I see them everywhere. Like I walked past a hair salon yesterday, and there's a picture of Christopher Walken in the window, and it said "Walk-ins welcome."
I'm a dad, and
We have a dad in the audience.
finally,
Speaking for all
I was
dads.
talking to my sons last night, and I said to them, "When does a joke become a dad joke?" And they said, "When the punchline becomes
Ooh. When does a joke become a dad joke? When the punchline becomes apparent. That's pretty damn good. Okay. I know we have to end now, but I have to juggle before because it said it in the description.